Does life imitate art, or the other way around? Can love and pain chart a course to the profound? To which souls are this man's heart forever bound? It's Lions and Tigers and Truth, oh my, in an episode that recounts a defining childhood moment and its fictional counterpart. You're listening to Buddha and the Slut, and this one's called My First Guru Had 4 Feet. I've always been a cat guy. This was long before my Buddhist friends told me stories of how cats are enlightened masters, here on earth to show us the way, or to demonstrate the meditative perfection of the feline purr, or, perhaps, how the life of a cat is seen in some traditions as a reward for good karma. When I lived in rural Nova Scotia as a child, the house was blessed with 2 cats named Midge and Mooch, tabby mixes who would come and go as they pleased and were kind enough, if not overly affectionate. I kept asking for a cat of my own, and my folks eventually buckled. For my 7th birthday, I received a black and white kitten with golden eyes and a salmon pink nose. He took to me instantly. Love at first meow. My parents kept pushing me to name him, but whenever I asked what he wanted to be called, he'd just scamper off. Cats are coy like that. A few weeks later, my dad pulled out a Canadian road atlas and told me to point to the first town that caught my eye. And that's how we finally settled on a name. Kitchener. I'd call for him, and he'd come without too much argument, so I guess the name wasn't that offensive, all things considered. For a lonely kid who lived in the middle of the farming and retirement community of Upper Granville, Nova Scotia, population 820, this was as close to friendship as I was likely gonna get. Thankfully, it was more than enough. A week after school let out for the summer, I was playing across the road on a rope swing attached to the neighbor's big elm tree. Kitchener would follow me sometimes, climbing up the trunk and perching above as I swung. I'd lean back to scan the sky, comforted by the blurred canopy of branches and the tiny black and white face nestled within. I heard my mom yell that dinner was in 20 minutes. It was a Sunday, so that meant pizza night, homemade dough, tomato paste, chunks of cheap pepperoni, shredded cheese. These things were manna from heaven for a 7-year-old. I leapt off the dangling wooden plank and ran across the road. I didn't hear Kitchener yowl behind me. I didn't hear the hooded jogger plodding close in the looming dusk shout his warning. I didn't hear the engine of the '68 Chevy growling down the highway, its elderly American passengers ripe with thoughts of seaside picnics and historic lighthouses. The only thing I heard was screaming. Mine. Screaming through the pain and the blood and the scorched terror, strobing in and out of consciousness, I remember my dad suddenly appearing over me, pale and distraught and panicked, and tearing off his flannel overcoat. For some reason, he started beating my leg with it. I screamed again. Howled, actually. He rolled me over and almost fainted. I'd find out later that my shoe and pant leg had caught on fire. I had slid across the road so fast after the impact that they had ignited. It didn't help that the hit sent me flying face first across the asphalt, or that my leg had sustained a serious compound fracture. I can't imagine how my father felt when he flipped me over and saw the sticky crimson mask and the shattered fibula and tibia tent-pulling through my jeans and flesh. His only child, adopted no less, the source of all of this horror. The rest of the injury tale is for another day. Suffice to say, I was hospitalized, hammered and stitched, physioed, and sent home with a cast up to my hip. But I wasn't sad. Even with the likely loss of full mobility in the future and the fact that we had just installed an above-ground pool for the summer to come, yup, The Simpsons copied my life, I'm assured the royalty check is in the mail. Still, I wasn't sad, because I had my cat to come home to. Kitchener would be there for me no matter what, because that's how best friends roll. Except, he wasn't. I'd call from the moldy army cot set up in the living room louder with each passing day, but only Midge and Mooch would come sniffing. I asked my parents to look for him back in the garden and across the road. They'd just wring their hands and promise to try. You see, I'd been laid up in the Halifax Sick Kids Hospital for nearly 2 weeks. My folks would make the 150-mile trek every day, bringing hopeful smiles, get-well cards from neighbors, and a miniature cribbage and chessboard to play on. They'd sneak in cake and ice cream, help the nurse with my bedpan offerings, and keep me from picking the constellation of scabs off my face. But what they didn't do, what they failed to tell me, was that Kitchener was dead. They found him on the side of the road one morning on the way north to visit me, in the exact same spot where I was hit. He was less than a year old, almost 7 in human years, almost the same as me. They had buried him on the back acreage near the edge of the vegetable garden, right beside the colonial graveyard where I liked to splay out on the stone slabs from the 1700s and see faces in the clouds, where Kitchener had spent his brief life stalking mice and bees while making sure I didn't get too lost in heavy, lonesome thoughts. My dad put me in a small utility trailer attached to the riding mower and took me out to see the grave. It was just a small mound of dirt crowned by hollyhocks and bluebells and long grass. I don't think I cried then. I only remember not looking at that mound of dirt again until months later when I was able to hobble there by myself. I was 7 years old when my cat died. I've tasted death since, other pets, family members, good friends, lovers. But Kitchener was my first. And when my young, broken self stared down at the tiny grave months later, a strange and timeless kind of calm washed over me as the tears began to flow. It was as if a contract had been fulfilled. During our brief time together, my cat brought the fuzziness of my existence into focus. Up until then, I had felt distant from life, apart from it, removed. Like I'd never truly be understood, so therefore I wasn't meant to be a part of the world around me. But his tiny, sweet presence snapped a fearful and guarded child out of his shell. His touch made that kid feel more connected to another living being than he had ever dreamt of feeling. His purr filled that fragile young heart with such unconditional love that the thought of ever losing it wasn't even a consideration. And that, I believe, is the lesson here. That unlike our expectations, our whims and desires, our material goods, or our fair-weather friendships, not all attachments are bad, even when they hurt, perhaps especially so. The real bonds, the ones we form on the deepest, most meaningful, most vulnerable levels, they reach us and change us, and the truth of them endures. My boyhood friend and I will always be together. Always. Frolicking in sunbeams in the infinite moment. But he could only teach me this by breaking my heart in death. My first guru had 4 feet. I guess those Buddhist friends were right after all. And there you have it, the straight poop. And if that's all you're after, then you can stop listening now, but you would be missing out. Because what we have here is a unique opportunity to witness how real-life events can directly shape the creative process. Some of you may know that I published a contemporary mystery fantasy horror novel back in 2014. I wrote it for brave young readers and cat lovers of all ages, and released it as the first volume in a 5-book epic called The Shadowland Saga. But what most folks don't know is that the childhood events I just shared with you were the genesis of this story. Formative year stuff that tilled the soil and planted those seeds deep. And 40 years on, I'm still making sense of it, of love and of loss, and honestly, of life itself. Because wiser men than I have said that that's the point of art, the purpose of art. That's what it's for. To help us bear the unknowable burdens of being alive and to help it all make sense. Which is why I'm proud to share with you now the fictional version of these events as told through the complete first chapter of The CAT'S MAW. Written by yours truly, set to a beautiful and haunting score by my episode 4 guest, Tobias Tinker, and narrated by the incredible David Kaye, who won an award for this performance and who you might know from his work on Last Week Tonight with John Oliver, Pixar's Up, and the Transformers animated series. Ooh, yes. I think you're going to dig it. So thanks again for listening, sharing, subscribing, reviewing, and all else that you do to support the show. I promise to be back with more tales from the long and winding road, for as long as you want to hear them.
The Cat'S MAW, The Shadowland Saga, Volume 1. Written by Brooke Burgess. Narrated by David Kaye. With music by Tobias Tinker. Chapter 1. Of Boys and Bones. Billy Brom was having a nightmare. Now, there's nothing the least bit peculiar about a 10-year-old boy having a bad dream, be it fanged beasts or exploding volcanoes, or having to go up in front of the entire school to give a speech in your underwear. There isn't much call for alarm.
Just remember that you're dreaming. Run away as fast and as far as you can, and then wake yourself up.
But this boy's dream was different. It was different because there was no way to escape from it. It was different because he was already wide awake. Elizabeth and Stanley Brom stood over their adopted son with masks of concern and frustration on their weary faces. For years, Billy's mother had scolded him for being accident-prone, causing them so much unnecessary worry, not to mention the implied expense.
You could trip on a whisker or cut yourself in a rubber room,
his mother would say, removing her glasses with a heavy sigh and furrowed brow. Stanley Brom would nod in agreement, keeping the fragile peace. As his mother continued to scold, Billy would watch his father turn and inch quietly from the room. The bald patch on the top of his head would bob out the back door and gleam its way across the lawn, disappearing behind the doors of his workshop. Billy couldn't argue with his mother. He may have been a smart boy, frighteningly smart, according to the standardized tests they gave at his school each year. But no amount of brain could dispute the boy's storied history of profound clumsiness. When Billy was 3, he fell down the stairs with a double-scoop strawberry cone. Shag carpet softened the blows and absorbed the ice cream and blood, limiting the boy's suffering to 2 chipped teeth, a fat lip, and the ridicule of his 3 foster siblings. When Billy was 4, he ran out of daycare, tripped on his untied shoes, and met the shale and gravel driveway face first. At the doctor's, he shrieked as the little man with a lazy eye slid a needle and thread 4 times through his upper lip. The boy's siblings, down to 2 now, were no less cruel with their laughter. When Billy was 5, a hulking 6th grader, lunging to avoid a dodgeball throw of vicious intent, slammed him into a tetherball pole. 6 weeks in a sling and a broken collarbone to add to his scorecard. Billy's sole sibling at the time, a shy blonde girl with a love for stuffed bears and a tendency to cry, asked him in all seriousness if he was cursed or just had really bad luck. 3 weeks later, Billy watched from the kitchen window as the girl was packed neatly with her bear into a long gray car that would whisk her away to another home. As he waved goodbye to her and remembered her words, he began to wonder the same thing. A jolt of pain brought him back to the present. Back to the living room and the squeaky, lump-infested cot. Back to the plaster cast on his leg and the reason he was trapped. His mother unfolded a newspaper, sat down beside the bed, and began clipping a piece from a page near the front. For a minute, Billy forgot his pain, hoping she'd found a coupon for ice cream or for the movies. His mother loved coupons as much as Billy loved ice cream, and movies, and dreams. Probably more. "Do you have any idea how lucky you are?" his mother asked. Oh, she wasn't really asking. She waved the strip of paper in front of his face. "You could have been killed. People must think we're awful parents." The news story was titled, "Summer Ruined for Local Boy." That's all he could make out, aside from his school photo. The unflattering picture showcased his prominent overbite, bulging brown eyes, and a lopsided mop of chestnut hair. Billy never saw himself as a handsome boy before, and now, after the accident, even less so. The throbbing in his leg made it hard to focus, and reading only made him dizzy. But the memories were slowly returning. They came to him in flickers of blood and flashes of screeching metal. 3 weeks earlier, the boy had turned 10. 2 weeks ago, he got a perfect report card. And last week, Billy Brom was hit by a car. Billy's mother had had enough. She was tired of the lounging in front of the TV, of the comic books strewn around the living room, and of the toy soldier wars that threatened to engulf the entire house. In short, her son's tendency to dream was fraying the tip of her last working nerve. "Silly Billy," she said. "I'd really like it if you found something to do outside, something productive. Ask your father for a chore, or build something, or maybe you could find a friend." She unscrewed the cap from a fat green bottle and poured red wine up to the rim of a juice glass on the counter. After a long sip, Billy watched her putting extra muscle into kneading the pizza dough. Her face reddened and began to resemble an heirloom tomato from their garden. That's when the boy decided it was unwise to stay and risk losing his special perfect report card dinner. Billy shuffled to the front hall. Arranged for him on the low hall table were the blue wristwatch and matching running shoes that he got for his birthday. He put them on, opened the door, and stepped out into the heat of the first Sunday of summer. Find a friend. It's something she had said many times before. This only convinced the boy that his mother didn't have the best grasp on their geographical reality. The Broms lived in Appleton, a tiny rural town in the heart of the Eastern Valley. It had a year-round population that hovered just shy of 800. The kids anywhere close to his age lived far away, past the sprawling orchards and sweet cornfields and dairy farms, on the other side of the hills. A trek like that was a daunting prospect in the heat of late June, with only a slim chance of success. Besides, after the year he'd had, Billy wasn't exactly keen to see anyone from his school anytime soon. He circled the house and wandered back to his father's workshop. It was a small gray shack with white trim and topped with tarry black shingles. The square door yawned open, and Billy peered inside. Paint-flecked plyboard walls were lined with hanging tools, and a set of old golf clubs was hoisted high in a shiny black bag near the door. Billy liked to watch his father work. Sometimes the man would spend all weekend in the shop, cutting and sanding pieces of sweet-smelling wood. The shop was filled with projects in various stages of build and design, unfinished masterpieces, as his mother called them. But that didn't seem to bother Stanley Brom. He looked happy just pushing the circular saw through a fresh plank of cedar, as he was doing at that moment. "Can I help?" Billy said. The boy wasn't eager to follow through on the offer, but it was cooler there in the shade of the shop. He waited for an answer, but the man kept on cutting. Billy knew his father was focused because his tongue was still sticking out the side of his mouth. "Dad, can I help?" Billy shouted. Stanley jerked his hands at the sound, shearing the wood at an ugly angle. Unlike his mother, Billy's father wasn't one to show big emotions. This made the boy nervous, because the man's moods were harder to read. But it didn't take a psychic to see the annoyance hanging in the air just then with all that wood dust. "Busy right now, son," his father said. He clicked off the saw and it whirred slow, stopping with a sudden chuck. How about you help your mom with the pizza? I'm sure she'd appreciate it. She sent me outside, Billy said. Of course she did, Stanley said, sliding off his safety goggles and wiping the sweat from his brow. As his son stood in the doorway, still and unblinking, Stanley fought the urge to turn away. There'd always been something he just couldn't place with the boy, something unsettling, something in his eyes that seemed to look right through people and take them apart. It's a gorgeous day, his father said. Summer vacation, right? Go find a friend and kick the ball around. Just don't get those new shoes too dirty. You know how your mother is. Stanley winked, put his goggles on, and set the saw in motion. His tongue slid back into its sideways work groove. The conversation was over. Find a friend. Billy was starting to get the hint. His parents weren't keen on tripping over him constantly for the next 2 months. But they were also drawing the line on their son becoming what the parenting books had described as borderline antisocial. Pickings were slim in the valley if you weren't after apples. Plundering anthills in the sandpit with toy trucks and a magnifying glass wasn't going to cut it. Neither would a summer spent daydreaming in his favorite place. Billy saw the looks his folks shared when he spent too much time there. That left only one option. Thankfully, it was a good one. Billy would make a point of crossing the road to visit the old Thomas place as often as he could. It was a big 2-story house with a stone foundation, chipped white siding and dark, dusty windows. It seemed to sag in the middle, as if the weight of its age had made it exhale and refuse to stand tall again. Yet it looked perfectly comfortable with its bad posture, peeling trim, and balding roof. The plants around the yard had grown tall and wild, defying the trimmed bushes and tidy squares of manicured lawn across the road. It was old, to be sure. Billy had read in the paper that it was probably built in the early 1800s, but his father, whose job it was to inspect buildings and assure the township that they measured up to municipal codes, had been in the basement to help with a plumbing mishap. He placed the stonework in the foundation at 50 years older than the paper's estimate, maybe more. The 1700s, back to the days of the first settlers, the beginning of Appleton. It was part of the reason the boy loved it so much, but only part. Billy had a ritual. First, he'd hop the ditch instead of using the driveway. Then he'd sit on the plank swing hanging from the huge elm out front. After a few swings, he'd leap into the grass, hunt for 4-leaf clovers, and then make his way around the side of the house. He'd move through the garden then, and approach the old stone arch. Its curious shape was cracked and sun-bleached, and covered in snaking vines and wildflowers. It had grooves and markings on its smooth surface, but they were too shallow to share any secrets. It was there beneath the stones, near the rose trellises and swaying sunflowers, with the sound of seashell wind chimes clattering in the breeze, that he would stop. And it was there that he would kneel in the grass, take a deep breath, and then call to them. Billy was there to see Mrs. Thomas's cats, which was all fine and good because the old lady's attention was divided in countless furry directions. There were fat cats and skinny cats, the long-tailed and the bobbed, the daring young leapers and the old windowsill sleepers, balls of waddling fluff, smooth-coated prowlers, and hairless ones that looked fragile and wise, the tiger-striped, the ring-tailed, and the ones with matching colored socks and mittens. There were tabbies and calicos, Manx and Persians, Siamese and Bombay, ragdolls and Burmans, Maine Coons and Russian blues. There were snowshoes and Somalis, Tonkinese and Turkish, and many, many more. Brown and beige and orange and gray and black and white and silver cats, each with gleaming eyes of emerald or sapphire or amber, a rainbow of precious stones. On that fateful afternoon, a white tabby with black spots, or was it black with white ones, had caught the boy's eye. It had just slipped out from one of the basement windows and was wiping its paws on the foundation. Billy crouched low, as he'd learned to do, and called to it.
Wuss, wuss, wuss.
He forced the air gently between his teeth and tongue, extended his hand along the ground, and rubbed his thumb in circles against the index and middle fingers. The cat stopped what it was doing, dropped to all fours, and turned to face him. Billy was struck by its golden gaze, the blacks of its eyes narrowing in the sunlight. The cat looked as if ink had spilled upon its head, painting a black helm that dribbled a dark spear down the bridge of its nose. This made its gleaming eyes and pink nostrils stand out all the more on its narrow face. The cat's ears, jet-tipped and pointy, stiffened and curled towards the sound. It crouched as it stared with its black tail flattened, swaying across the loose dirt.
This is not for you, child.
Billy thought that if the creature could speak, that's what it would say. This was clearly a foolish thought. As anyone with sense will tell you, cats can't talk. Yet Mrs. Thomas had claimed many times, over homemade apple pie with chunks of cheddar that she shared with her furry beggars, that cats could talk perfectly well, thank you very much. The problem was that most of us had forgotten how to listen. The cat blinked and scampered off. Billy gave chase, following it through the long grass. He ran past the crumbling gazebo and the stone well and around the giant elm, whose lowest branch still held the swing in a lazy embrace. He followed the cat all the way to the property's edge, watching it weave through the ditch and onto the road. He kept on following until it stopped in the middle of the far lane. The cat sat down on the pavement with half-opened eyes and measured breaths, and turned its head down the road to the north. There was a growing shape in the dusk, faint and gray like a shadow. It was moving fast and coming straight towards them. Billy heard a voice.
No more.
The moments that followed were an insane blur. Shock and agony, blood and breathlessness, waves of sheer terror, not all of them Billy's. His mind flashed, and his parents stood over him. They were shaking and crying, and waving traffic through as they called for help. As he lay there, crumpled and bloody on the ribbon of asphalt, the boy remembered running out to help a cat for some reason. And when he heard his mother's wail over the hushed chatter of those who stopped to gawk, Billy tried very hard to convince himself that it was all just a terrible dream. When the ambulance arrived, he was loaded onto a stretcher with a sickening jolt. He thought he heard someone say that he'd slid across the road so fast that the soles of his new shoes had melted. His wristwatch was smashed, and his best jeans were beyond the help of any seamstress or commercial cleanser. But those were just things. Far worse were the shattered bones and dangling tendons poking through the side of his shin, the flesh failing at its job of keeping them all in place. Siren blaring, the ambulance sped north. Darkness was quick to descend, transforming the vehicle into a wheeled firefly that darted and flashed as it steered through the night. Inside, the red light set an eerie scene. The attendant's face was shadowed and grim as he steadied the boy's stretcher. Stanley Brom crouched in silence beside him. Through a pained haze, the boy thought he saw tears running down the man's cheeks. It must have been a dream, for Billy had never seen his father cry. It took 45 minutes to reach the Middleton emergency room. The driver had radioed ahead, and the on-call doctor met them at the door. A pasty man with thinning hair, a wide jaw, and small, precise eyes. His voice was steady as he directed everyone inside, and remained calm when he saw the extent of Billy's injuries. As a nurse dabbed stinging liquid at the wounds on Billy's face, the doctor removed the boy's melted shoe and cut through the blood-soaked denim on his leg. Billy screamed as the jeans peeled away from his shin, and the pale man whitened another shade. He shouted something at the nurse, and Billy moaned as a large needle jabbed into his hip. There was a muddle of voices as a numbing relief swept through his body. The boy tried to thank them, but the words wouldn't come, and the room went black. Another burst of pain, and Billy slid from the wooden carryboard and onto a cold, stiff bed. 2 hours had passed, and he'd been taken to the Children's Hospital all the way up in Bridgeton. The attending physician had an angled face and shaggy hair, and seemed flustered by all the screaming. He asked the boy's father for some details, shook his hand, and had him sent from the room. Thus began Billy's week in the hospital, a fuzzy, melted jumble of memories. There was the initial operation to set his leg, painkiller drips and soiled bedsheets, dry meat and warm jello, bedside rounds of cribbage where the boy would skunk his mother twice with a miraculous 29-point hand. Then came physio. The nurses wrapped his cast in plastic and had Billy swim in a blue pool that stung his eyes. They gave him a pair of creaky wooden crutches and had him practice moving in the halls between meals. They massaged his face with sticky liquids and used tweezers to pull off the crusty scabs from his cheeks, chin, and forehead. The hospital staff all gave the kindest smiles, used the gentlest touches, and spoke in the friendliest voices. They were nice when Billy cried, or when he was lazy, or even when he had a tantrum. This confused the boy even more than the painkillers did. Each day, his black-brown stare searched their faces for clues, probed for secrets, scanned for lies. Something's wrong, he thought. It was a long drive south on that rainy morning in early July. Little was said, as Billy'd been given a sedative before they departed. When the Brahms finally arrived home, Stanley carried his son inside. Elizabeth went straight to the kitchen, poured a glass of milk, and filled a plate with chocolate chip cookies. Billy's heart sunk when he awoke, finding himself on a musty cot downstairs. It was too far away from his comics and his toys, and his wallpaper adorned with pirate ships and treasure maps. It was too far from his bedroom window, which looked out upon the rolling fields and weeping willow trees. It was too far from the view of his favorite place in the world. Another jolt brought Billy back to the present. He had been home for several days now, and things didn't feel much better. He was still downstairs. The cot was still lumpy. The cast was still heavy and scratched his thighs raw. Then there was the horrible tingling, the maddening itch where the bones had pushed through the flesh, that he was unable to scratch. The more he thought about it, the more upset he became, and the more the itch spread. It was creeping up his leg, moving higher every second. It finally made camp in his ears and went to work in his brain. Billy's eyes welled with tears, and the low groan that was born in his belly grew to a howl in his lungs.
"It's okay, Billy. I'll be there in a second. I've got your favorite,"
his mother shouted from the kitchen. She shuffled across the linoleum and onto the living room carpet, carrying a tray of food that was piping hot. He was soothed a little as the smells worked their magic. Tomato soup, a grilled cheese sandwich, and a glass of chocolate milk. She propped up the cot and tilted the glass of milk into her son's mouth. She couldn't help but sigh as much of it ran down his chin, splashed on his chest, and soaked into the sheets.
"Drink it down," his mother said. "It will all be better soon."
"No, it won't," the boy said. Billy met his mother's gaze as he drank. He watched her pupils dilate and contract. He drank more and saw her nostrils flare, and tiny beads of sweat glisten on her upper lip. He swallowed the rest, and was suddenly aware of a bitter, metallic taste that lingered on the back of his tongue. A sound grew in Billy's head then, distant at first, yet strangely familiar. It was something he hadn't heard since that terrible day, just before the accident. A voice. As the milk swam through his belly and into his veins, it grew louder. Billy's vision blurred. The sights and smells and pains of the waking world drifted away in the drugged ether, until only the voice remained.
No,
it hissed.
no more,
It cried in the darkness.
we sleep no more.
And that's when the real nightmare began.